So good morning, afternoon, good night. We are very happy to welcome you in this session. This session is about reporting on glaciers in 2025. And this event is organized by WMO, the World Meteorological Organization, and UNESCO. I am Brigitte Perrin from WMO, and I'm happy to introduce you to my co-facilitator, François Wibaux from UNESCO. François, can you show yourself?
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this information session.
Okay, everyone can hear me because it seems some people cannot hear me. Seems to be okay, wonderful. So today, journalists from 64 countries registered to the session. So it will be a real global briefing on the science of glaciers. And this session should give you all the necessary background to report on glaciers in 2025, as this year is the International Year of Glaciers Preservation. Before introducing our experts, let's have a quick tour of the context in which we are organizing this event. Ahmad, if you can bring up the slides, the first one, please. Okay, so the objectives, of course, of this international year, and there will be also the first World Day for Glaciers on the 21st of March, is of course to raise awareness about the glaciers, to promote any action on glaciers preservation, enhancing the scientific understanding, and this is why you are all meeting here today, and obviously aiming at strengthening the policy frameworks at the government levels as well, and of course the financial support. Next. So what is the context? Today we have more than 275,000 glaciers around the world, and about 70% of the global freshwater is glaciers or ice sheets. This is a lot, of course. In addition, WMO just confirmed a couple of days ago that 2024 was the warmest year on record, and this has an importance for glaciers. In 2023, we saw the largest mass loss in the 5 decades for glaciers, and it was the second consecutive year in which all regions of the world with glaciers reported ice loss. So, of course, melting glaciers threaten the long-term water security for millions of people, and smaller glaciers, like in Europe, Eastern Africa, and in the Andes and Indonesia, they projected to lose more than 80% of their ice mass by 2100. If we keep emitting greenhouse gases like we do today. And the retreat of the high mountain glaciers and cryosphere will obviously affect recreational activities as well, tourism and cultural assets. We'll see it. Next, please. So the objectives of this year of glaciers, for us at WMO, really monitoring, expanding glaciers monitoring system in order to be able to analyze the glaciers, develop early warning systems for any hazards downstream that are happening because of glaciers melt, promoting sustainable water resource, because some water in the world that we drink, most of the water we drink come either from glaciers or come from the mountains, of course. Preserving cultural heritage and traditional knowledge is something extremely important as well. And we want to engage youth in this glaciers preservation as they are the next generation. Next. So at WMO, we encourage countries to share data and information about the cryosphere in general and to cooperate, whatever political context there is, and we have different programs for that. We are coordinating all the monitoring of ice sheets and glaciers data. Through some of our State of Climate report, we can see this coordinated effort being showcased. We are monitoring the climate change impact and the change in hydrology and water resources downstream. We are collaborating to multiple studies that are linked to the cryosphere, and we are also extensively working on developing efficient early warning systems, and we have an initiative called Early Warnings for All that aims at protecting everyone on Earth with early warning systems by 2027. I'm giving the floor now to François, who will tell you a bit more about the UNESCO's work and what events are coming up in the coming months.
Thanks very much, Brigitte. So most of you here are probably familiar with UNESCO, but might wonder why our organization specifically has been tasked by the UN to lead on the topic of glaciers along with the WMO. So as the UN agency for science, but also education and culture, our unique mandate gathers experts from all different fields to tackle problems in a very multidisciplinary way. So at face value, the melting of glaciers is obviously a scientific issue, but it's also an education issue when you look at the fact that only 50% of national curriculums even mention climate change, and we need to raise a generation that can continue to preserve these glaciers. Glaciers are also deeply a cultural issue when we think of the practices and the traditions that exist only amongst communities that live in glacial regions. So what is UNESCO actually doing about these glaciers? Our role is mainly to highlight scientific research and to streamline glacier science across the world. UNESCO is developing adaptation strategies to face the impact of glacier melt on things like water availability and supply, on agriculture, on wildlife. And we're able to provide actionable policy recommendations to our member states. So UNESCO designated sites are quite key in this. About 10% of the world's glaciers are actually located in just 50 World Heritage sites, with others spread out across biosphere reserves and UNESCO global geoparks. So while we're able to study these glaciers up close, and we produce reports, including a recent one that showed 50% of the glaciers in World Heritage sites will disappear by the end of the century if emissions continue at current rates. And no matter what the climate scenario is, about 1/3 of these glaciers will disappear by 2050. And that includes some of the most iconic glaciers, like the last ones on the African continent, on Mount Kilimanjaro, on Mount Kenya. UNESCO also publishes the World Water Development Report, which is the UN's flagship annual report on water. And this year, it will focus specifically on glaciers with the title Mountains and Glaciers Are Water Towers. UNESCO also coordinates missions on the ground that really blend our expertise between science and culture. So our latest expedition, for example, is in Uganda in the Rwenzori Mountains World Heritage Site, where indigenous people literally consider these glaciers as gods, and they say that their gods today are melting. So along with the documentary crew, we're using aerial drone mapping, ground penetrating radar, high precision 3D modeling to basically preserve and protect these glaciers. Part of the work also involves combating climate change denialism and disinformation that's often rampant online, so that everyone can agree on the basic facts and believe that we do need to preserve glaciers. Now, next slide, please. Before we dive into the presentations, I'm just going to give you a few key dates coming up in this year of glacier preservation. So the first to note is going to be on the 21st of January, next Tuesday, which is going to be the official launch of the international year. There'll be a main event in Geneva and about 40 side events across regions and time zones. So a lot of them will be online. So we hope that you can join wherever you are in the world. The next slide, please. About this, the launch will be sending you a press release within the coming days. The following dates are going to be in March. So on the 21st of March is going to be the very first World Day for Glaciers. So it's an opportunity to mobilize political will and really raise public awareness on an important topic, but as you know, sometimes gets relegated in the busy news cycle. This is going to be supported on that same day by the release of the World Water Development Report on glaciers. And we recognize that journalists like facts and figures, but also incredible storytelling and images. And so on that same day, we'll also be releasing the results of the expedition I mentioned in the Rwenzori Mountains World Heritage Site with incredible images and data on these glaciers. Just after World Glacier Day will be World Water Day on the 22nd of March, also focused on the theme of glaciers, followed by World Meteorological Day, which will be themed around early warnings for all and including topics on glaciers. And finally, in May, on the 29th of May, there'll be an international conference on glacier preservation in Dushanbe in Tajikistan. And beyond all these specific dates, this year and this day for glaciers, 2025 also marks the start of the UN Decade of Action on Cryospheric Science. So this is going to be led by UNESCO to implement a comprehensive and program over 10 years aimed at addressing the challenges that are posed by glacier melt. Next slide, please. We're going to give you a lot of information today, but you can find everything you need to know at un-glaciers.org. And I'll now hand over to Brigitte for a few housekeeping rules before we get into the presentations. Brigitte?
Yes, thank you very much, François. So just a few things, some quick information. You all have access to the chat of this meeting, and you can ask questions during the whole session. But questions need to be related to glaciers or to this session. We will not respond to any other topic. We don't have time for that, and we want to make the best of our time. Please put your name and affiliation in the Zoom identification, or you can also put it at the beginning of your question if you want. We will now give the floor to our experts and take one question, only one after each expert, and then at the end of the presentations, we will have an extended Q&A session where we will answer all your questions. We may merge some of them, so please be aware that some of the questions will have to be put together. Please note that this session is recorded. The recording of the presentations will be shared with all the registered participants, including those who didn't manage to join today, by Monday, 20th of January, the day before the launch. Now, I'm thrilled to give the floor to John Pomeroy from University of Saskatchewan in Canada. John is also UNESCO Chair in Mountain and Water Sustainability. John, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be speaking to everyone today. And we'll start off with a view from the St. Elias icefield in southwestern Yukon, Canada, with a view of Mount Logan, the highest mountain in Canada behind it. These are the types of massive ice masses that are threatened by climate change. Next slide, please. So we'll start off with putting the perspective of mountain glaciers in the water and climate and ecological and human system, and realize that glaciers are a part of changing mountain water towers, and many things are going on in the water towers. Water towers provide fresh water for about 2 billion people on the planet. Much of this from melting snow and rainfall, but also important contributions from glacier melt. And we will be focusing on that glacier melt contribution. But there's other things going on there. Thaw of permanently frozen ground, we call permafrost. The climate is warming faster at higher elevations. Vegetation is responding. Where I live in Western Canada, we've had dramatic wildfires that have destroyed parts of UNESCO World Heritage Sites in the last few years, and the soot from these fires has darkened glaciers. Stream flows are changing downstream, and this is affecting billions of people. Of course, humanity, major civilizations in many areas have developed from irrigation from mountain water tower water, and that is now threatened, as is water supply for major cities. But then glaciers are retreating, and we'll get into that, their negative mass balance, what that means, their loss of snow and ice, and other aspects. So next slide, please. The glaciers are part of a system of ice around the world, and alpine glaciers are constrained by the mountain valleys which they originate and the valley walls that confine them. And so the uppermost photograph is a typical one that you might see there. Somewhat larger than the alpine glaciers are the ice fields, such as the opening slide I showed you, the St. Elias. And these occupy large areas of highlands. They can be hundreds of square kilometers, and they're drained by outlet glaciers, which are the ones that are most easily seen. But those ice fields themselves contain very thick ice and are massive sources of fresh water for our oceans. A bit larger, thousands of square kilometers, are the ice sheets, and this is where the topography is completely overwhelmed by the ice. It buries the peaks. So think Greenland and Antarctica. And so as we look at the major mountain ranges around the world, the alpine glaciers dominate. As you go further north in many areas or further south, then we get more ice fields, and then the ice sheets in the coldest parts of the planet. Next slide, please. Okay, so we can view glaciers as a vast water bank account, and the income to that bank account is the snow accumulation, which occurs at the highest elevations of the glaciers, where you see the blue upward arrows in here. And the withdrawals from that bank account are the lower part of the glacier, where we have melt, or sometimes called ice ablation, because it includes evaporation at the lower part of the ice. And that's the part where the ice is exposed, and that's what we're losing. Next slide, please. We define in glaciology something called the equilibrium line altitude, or ELA, the red line you see across the glacier. It's basically the physical divide between areas where snow is accumulating above the red line and where ice is melting below the red line. And so we have exposed ice or firn, which is very, very old snow, below that line. And the location of the LA determines whether a glacier is gaining mass or losing mass. And this is very important for us right now, because we tend to be losing. Next slide, please. So other thing it's important to realize is ice is flowing downhill from accumulation to ablation zones. It's flowing downhill under the influence of gravity. And, in English, we talk about a glacial pace. It's not flowing very fast, but it is very, very persistent. And of course, it erodes rocks and moves lots of material as it moves downstream. But the persistence of this means even a glacier that's retreating is still flowing downhill, downstream towards its outlet. And next slide, please. Here's a nice video time-lapse from central Switzerland over a one-year period showing this flow of ice. So it's flowing from where snow accumulation persists and feeds the glacier over the year downhill to where ice melt is causing the loss of mass and ablation of the glacier over the year. And so if you could sit for a very long time, you'd see something like that. Next slide, please. And here's another visualization of that over from satellite from the Mer de Glace in the French Alps. Next slide, please. Okay, so glaciers are not always in a perfect mass balance where there's no change in mass. And in colder periods of climate, then they have more snowfall and perhaps less melt. And this means that they can advance. That equilibrium line altitude declines in elevation. The red line is moved down, as you see. And so there's more snow accumulated in the top, less ice melt. The glacier grows, and therefore it must advance, and it advances. This occurred in the Little Ice Age in Europe and other areas hundreds of years ago. Almost nowhere is that occurring right now. Next slide, please. This is what is occurring right now. The equilibrium line altitude has risen in elevation in glaciers around the world, meaning a much smaller accumulation zone at the highest elevations, much more rapid melt at the lower elevations because of exposed ice, and exposed ice is darker than snow. And of course, this glacier now is losing mass, which means that stream flow from the glacier is increasing. And we are using this water around the world and getting used to using that water. And that is a very dangerous thing as well. So this is unfortunately the situation we have in many areas of the world. In fact, in many glaciers in the last few years, the equilibrium line altitude is up over the top of the glacier, meaning there is no snow that is making it through the summer. it's all melting, and there's no feed of mass into the glacier. So the glaciers are exposed ice in the summer, melting away in the heat, and that's the problem we have now. Next slide, please. So in recent history, what sort of water contributions from glaciers might we have? This is a typical one coming out of the UNESCO World Heritage Site in the Canadian Rockies to the city of Calgary, Alberta, through the Bow River. And it's about 3% of the annual stream flow at Calgary, which doesn't sound like much, but in late summer, the flow is about 20% of the Bow River is supplied from ice melt. And the crucial thing is that in the drought years, this can rise even higher and provide stability and drought proofing to rivers like this, which feed vast agricultural regions. And there are many more of these around the world. Next slide, please. Now, not all glaciers are clean ice. And in many parts of the world, because of glacier retreat and lowering of glaciers and debris collapse from thawing permafrost in the mountains and other erosion events, we have debris-covered glaciers dominating vast areas. And this is where rock, dust, soot, other things are covering the glaciers. This is an extreme example in Nepal. Next slide, please. That debris is interesting because if it's very, very thick, it can slow the melt rate of ice, as you see on the left-hand side with that, what looks like a mushroom with the rock, preventing the melt of ice underneath that deep rock. But where we have very thin debris, and this can be debris from dust or from soot or carbon and biological materials, then that can darken the ice and increase the melt rate. Next slide, please. This is an example of this. You see the darkening ice on the left, and this is a combination of soot and dust and other materials. And if we zoom into it, but it's also full of life. And there are viruses, there are bacteria, there are fungi, there are algae, all living on the ice, all consuming these deposits on the ice. So glaciers are alive in every sense of the world, and they're melting faster as a result, and they're darkening around the world as a result. Next slide, please. So as glaciers melt, the meltwater is transmitted very, very quickly through internal conduits in the glaciers to the downstream area. And you can see one of these conduits, it's almost like a subglacial river meandering under the river, being exposed as this glacier melts here in a time sequence that you see. And so glaciers are full of water as well as full of ice, an important thing to realize. Next slide, please. So as we look forward to how much water we might get from glaciers in the future, it's rather grim. We've become used to glaciers with a mass balance such that they're losing mass every year, and the equilibrium line altitude is very high. And that means they're adding fresh water to our system in late summer. Here you have a computer simulation showing the current stream flow from Peyto Glacier in the Canadian Rockies. And that's in black with gray showing the range of variation over many, many years. And then in red, you have the simulation with the glacier 97% removed and the climate warmed about 5 to 6 degrees, which is what is predicted for this region. Also an increase in rainfall in that area. And so we can see dramatic changes to the downstream hydrology from this glacier, a 7% decrease in annual stream flow, but a 93% increase in June stream flow because snowmelt is occurring earlier now, and that's driving things. But July, August stream flows dropped by 53%, and so that can be disastrous for the trout that depend on this, for salmon in different areas, because the water is going to be much warmer as well. And then peak flows have dropped by 30% and are occurring 1 month earlier, which is problematic for the irrigation districts downstream, which rely upon this water. And then now we see stream flow occurring in the winter as we get midwinter melts and midwinter rainfall. So next slide, please. So lots of changes hydrologically occurring here. So wrapping up, it's not just glaciers and science, glaciers and culture are deeply embedded within all of our societies around the world, as we have all been Ice Age people to some degree on every continent. Here is art from an artist, Gennady Ivanov, part of a UNESCO publication called The Great Thaw, which will be launched in March of this year. And this is showing that Peyto Glacier that I was giving you an example of, code red, using a quote from the Secretary General. And of course, he's showing the wildfires behind it, the darkening surface, the algae growing, the meltwaters emanating from it, the ice literally breaking up into ice flows, and very dark, hot future ahead. And this is the sort of communications that artists can help us to deal with the emotional impacts of global deglaciation, which we have. So I'll wrap up there, and thank you so much. End of my slides.
Thanks so much, John. We'll just go to a very quick question from the audience. You had mentioned debris on the surface of glaciers, and we've got a question asking, is there any quantifiable data on the cumulative effect of sulfur emissions from volcanoes on glaciers? We know that sulfur dioxide has a cooling effect, but is there global data on the impact on glaciers? And if we can keep to short answers so we have time to everything.
Short answer is not much. Volcanoes, for glaciers, the important part of volcanoes are that they're emitting dust. And when volcanoes are close to ice, then that dust can darken a glacier surface. There also have been cases of volcanoes under glaciers, such as Mount St. Helens, which caused dramatic rapid glacier melt and flooding downstream. But those are rare and extreme events. So it's mostly the darkening of the glacier surface that we have, and the possible acidification of meltwaters through deposits such as sulfur. Thank you.
Thanks so much, John. And now I'd like to leave the floor to our next two speakers, Dr. Samuel Nussbaumer from the World Glacier Monitoring Service, who will give a short presentation on how we measure and collect information on glaciers. And then Dr. Isabelle Gärtner, who will speak about the latest scientific data and trends on glaciers. Over to you, Samuel.
Yes, thank you very much. So it's a pleasure to give you a short overview of how we actually measure glaciers. So we have heard about these two parts of glaciers, the accumulation area and the ablation area. And as we can see on the next slide, first, I want to explain you, it's also two kinds of measurements. First, in the higher part of the glacier, so it's the part covered with snow. We want to know how much water is stored in this snowpack, and for that we have to go visit the site after 1 year. And then, as you can see in the sketch to the upper left, there you can see the snow that accumulated over 1 year, and then we have to dig a snow pit and measure the density of this snow to get to know the water content. So that is to say the amount of mass that has been accumulated on the glacier in 1 year. Then on the ablation area, on the next slide, it's a different kind of measurement. There we have melt, so we are on the ice, so there is no snow after 1 year, because this has already melted before. So for that we have to dig with different techniques, a stake into the ice that you can see in red to the left. And the same here, after 1 year, we visit the site, and then we can see the amount of ice that has been melted at the surface there, and we can read the length of the stake sticking out of the ice. So that can be 3 to 5 meters or even more. It depends on the site where you are. We can do that with the steam drill that is shown here on the picture, or also a mechanical drill. So there are different systems that can be used. For that, then we combine all these point measurements and interpolate them over the entire glacier area, and to get to know the mass that has been lost or maybe gained on the glacier during the course of 1 year. It's important to say that all these data are elaborated with our collaborator network. So the World Glacier Monitoring Service maintains a big collaborator network with thousands of observers worldwide that send then their data to the World Glacier Monitoring Service to make them available to everyone. And on the next slide, we can see how this can look like, for example, for one region, the European Alps. Here you can see the mass balance of the glaciers, so the change glaciers had in mass over 5 years. But this image, it shows you a period of 5 years only. So you might think, oh, that's a good, well, glaciers are doing fine and they are actually gaining mass. So no need to worry. But on the next slide, you can see the long-term trend here. That is actually the opposite. So that's important to mention that we have to continue these measurements over the long term to really capture the long-term character that also glaciers reflect. And important, if we click once more, that all these data are also open access, also following the WMO open data policy. So that's the measurements on the ice. And on the next slide, we can see, yes, one more, another type of measurements that are the remote sensing approaches. So we can, if we on the next slide see, for example, here, this glacier can be also observed from remote, from a plane, or from different satellites that can be seen on the next slides. And with these, we are now able to observe glaciers in the world, also in very remote places, and get here the surface of the glacier during different points in time, just then when the satellite has passed and observed the surface of the ice. With that, we combine all these data together, and on the next slide, you can see that there is a strategy behind. That's the Global Terrestrial Network for Glaciers that aims at combining these in situ measurements on the ice with the remotely sensed data. So with that, we can get the combination of process understanding on the ice with the global coverage, because we can only get the overview of the more than 275,000 glaciers with help of the satellite. It's impossible to do that by visiting all these glaciers, of course. And finally, we also combine then the traditional measurements with modern technologies. That is to say, the old the measurements on the ice that has already been done in the end of the 19th century. But now the emergence of satellite data, of course, it only came over the last years. And today we also have new other technologies like drones, or for example, stakes, smart stakes that measure in real time the change of glacier change at the surface. So with that, we want to know what are the latest data, and I want to give over to my colleague Isabelle that will present you now the latest results.
Thank you so much, Samuel. And I'm happy to report on the glacier changes. So we heard before from John about the characteristics of glaciers, and Samuel now explained how we measure the change. And I want to come back to what was said in the beginning, that glaciers are important climate indicators. And I show here all these so-called ECVs, essential climate variables, that we work with and where we quantify the changes that are seen or that can be measured and that make an influence on our environment, society, and so on. So next, please, which shows this glacier symbol here as part of the cryosphere. Next slide, please. And we see this beautiful variety of different glacier types we heard also before. So we have glaciers terminating on land, in steep or flat topography. We have glaciers terminating in lakes or in the sea. But independent of this beauty, next please, we are mainly interested in finding out or getting to know how much ice is out there, so how many glaciers are out there, and how fast do these glaciers change. And this is what we do with the World Glacier Monitoring Service. Next slide, please. So we heard from Samuel about the different techniques. You see here the two figures, and the upper figure from the glaciological method, so the in situ measurements that are performed for a couple of or some 100 glaciers worldwide, and then in the lower sketch from the geodetic method, so where we use airborne sensors or satellite sensors to quantify these changes, and these are combined, as Samuel already said. And on the next slide, you then see how this global picture looks like. These dark red crosses indicate the glaciological sample. So with a lot of effort, people go to the glaciers, measure single points, aggregate the data for the entire glacier, and submit this data to us. And you see the number, it's made for about 500 glaciers worldwide. And when you have the number in mind that was said in the beginning, 270,000 glaciers, this is just a small sample. So here, the remote sensing data really helps a lot and helped us to boost this information. And you see this geodetic sample in blue. And with the combination of both, we now cover almost the complete glacier area of the world. and have information on the changes of these glaciers. Next, please. So this is then translated in different ways that we need. So for the global picture, we can show this kind of heat map. And you see here the years, every strip is 1 year from 1976 to 2023. And you can see that the years are more and more negative, the values. You see the balance or the legend below from the glacier mass change. In dark red is very negative, and in blue is a positive value. We can translate this also on the next slide, please, for single years. This is then the year 2023. You see again a global map indicating again the regions where we find the glaciers, and we can easily see, so there's no blue dots, so none of the regions shows positive mass balances, and we can also see that there are regions that show very dark red symbols, like in Alaska or also the European Alps, and there we have these very negative values. Next slide, please. We can also accumulate the information, which is here shown for the global in meter water equivalent. You see here now from starting the measurements again in the 70s, we ended up with minus 12.1 meter water equivalent for the global. But we can also see different regions. So on the upper thin line, you see the Antarctic. You see that there has been periods with quite positive values, but also here we have now negative values, or on the very negative side, the southern Andes. Next slide, please. This regional information is shown in this sketch here, again from the 70s to 2023. We can then have a look how the different regions look like, that we had regions with positive balances, and now for the last, I would say 5 years, we have negative values in all of these regions. And then when we zoom in one region, Central Europe, for example, next slide, please, we can then quantify this and give further indications. For example, for the Swiss glaciers, we lost about 10% in the last 2 years. Next slide. So we have seen that we can easily recognize this change with our eyes, which is given here by this photo comparison from Vernachtferne and the Austrian Alps. This is easily accessible. That's also why the glaciers are such a good indicator. With the data that we compile, as indicated in the lower left, we quantify these changes and can use them for different analysis. But important, next, is the question, why does this change of the glaciers matter? And we will hear also in the next presentation more about local effects like geohazards, or also mentioned before, very important, the impact on the global water storage. And here, of course, the melting glaciers contribute to sea level rise. You can, I hope you can see it here in the sketch. Our glaciers are in the lowermost part, so the dark violet color, and it says that they contribute about 1 millimeters, a bit more at the moment, per year to sea level rise, which seems not so much. But if we would lose all our glaciers, then we would have an increase in the water, in the sea level of about 32 centimeters. Next slide, please. And with this, we want to, Samuel and I, we want to close our part with this nice or also sad photo of the Rhone Glacier and the Swiss Alps with this coverage, which is here was made for this ice cave, to protect the ice cave, to have it open for the tourists. And we want to have an eye on our glaciers and keep watching our glaciers. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Samuel and Isabelle. We've got time for a quick question from the audience, which actually transitions perfectly with your last photo. Someone who's asking, are initiatives such as covering glaciers in the summer, could they be considered as an expensive drop in the ocean, or are they really useful? For Isabelle or Samuel?
Yes.
Yeah, maybe I can just.
What you want?
Yeah. So, of course, locally, this coverage with the tissue of the ice can make absolutely sense. For example, when we have a ski run and then we want to have this connection of the ski run to the glacier and compensate this melting ice. here, very locally, it makes sense, or this example of the ice cave, but we speak about global glacier mass loss, ice loss. So on this global scale, this makes absolutely no sense, and it's also quite expensive.
Thank you so much for that. I'd now like to bring in our next speaker and leave the floor to Dr. Neera Pradhan, who's with the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development, who's going to tell us about the social and environmental impacts of glacier change. Over to you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Can I have the slides, please? In the previous presentations, we have heard about the general concepts of glaciers and the science of cryosphere. So in my presentation, I'll focus more on the societal and environmental impacts of changes in cryosphere and its hazards, especially the role of glaciers as key elements in the high mountain human nature ecosystems based on the research, especially the research conducted by ICIMOD and the partners. Next slide, please. This is the framework that shows the linkages between cryosphere, which is the snow, glaciers, and the permafrost, hydrosphere, rainfall, runoff, and hazards, biosphere, which is the species, ecosystem, and services, and society, which are the livelihood, culture, and the disaster. So this slide also focuses on the processes within and between the spheres that I have mentioned about, and observed changes and impacts and responses to these changes. There are, as you can see, the interconnections and interactions between cryosphere, water, ecosystems, and society. So these interconnections are particularly important to consider in the context of climate and non-climatic changes, as changes in one sphere can have chain effect throughout the other spheres, and small shifts can also lead to bigger impacts. Next slide, please. This framework again then highlights the cryospheric impacts, impact drivers, which are the cryospheric conditions or changes that can influence in the context of high mountain societies, such as changes in glacier mass, meltwater, and snow cover, which affects the 4 dimensions of these aspects. These are the livelihood, which when we talk about livelihood, it's more agriculture, livelihood, tourism in this region, and water security, what means more of water resource availability, water scarcity, and water quality. The culture is more about cultural heritage, mountain sacredness, and the disaster risk, especially the exposure and the vulnerability. So it has the interconnection between each other. Next slide, please. So here in this figure, you can see that we are experiencing changes from both climate-induced drivers and non-climate-induced drivers and its interactions. So we cannot say that all changes are because of climatic or changes in cryosphere, but there can also be non-climatic drivers of change. These changes in cryospheric impact drivers, just like the glacier melt or snow loss, and non-climatic impact of drivers, such as the land use changes and the economic shift, as you can see here, interact in very complex ways, as you can see in this figure. And their combined effects can amplify risks, disrupt ecosystem and societies, or create adaptation opportunities, shaping the resilience of future of the affected regions. As you can see here, non-climatic impacts and climatic cryospheric changes are interacting with each other and creating the interactions and the impacts. Next slide, please. With these concepts, I would like to talk a little bit about how these changes are impacting the Hindu Kush Himalaya region where ICIMOD is working. So HKH region, as you know, is also considered as the third pole because it holds the largest amount of ice and snow outside the North Pole, Arctic region, and the South Pole, Antarctic. So as a vital part of the global cryosphere, it supports water resources, biodiversity, and livelihoods for millions, making it crucial for climate and ecological balances. So impact in this region will impact billions of people and lives and livelihoods downstream of the region. Next slide, please. But research from the International Cryosphere Climate Initiative shows that HKH cryosphere is warming twice as fast as the global average. That means, again, I would like to emphasize that there is a rapid warming that accelerates glacier melt, disrupts water cycles, increases disaster risks in our region, and threatens the livelihood of millions dependent on the region's water resources. Next slide, please. So one of the examples that we have already facing is in June 2021 is the Melamchi flood in Nepal, which is one of the examples of cryospheric-driven cascading impacts on livelihoods and life of people. As you can see here, ICIMOD has done a research, and the finding says that glacier and hydrological triggers like snowfall, followed by heavy rainfall and snowmelt combined increased river discharge in this river. Then the glacier lake outburst floods, landslides, and massive sediment flow carried huge volumes of debris and boulder, which buried farmlands and settlements in this area. Riverbeds rose due to excessive sediment deposition, increasing future flood risks in the Melamchi River. And it also impacted one of the national pride Melamchi water supply project, which suffered severe destruction. Besides that, bridges, roads, hydropower plants, and homes were swept away, cutting off access to essential services. Hundreds of families were displaced, losing homes and agricultural lands. Fisheries, tourism, and local business suffered long-term economic losses. So this is one of the examples. Next slide, please. The components of cryosphere also play a major role in cultural, religious, and spiritual beliefs and practices of high mountain societies and influence their well-being. Human societies have given spiritual relevance to the high mountain since ancient times, and pilgrimage, especially in the mountain areas, have been made since the beginning of recorded human history. Losses of aesthetic properties and of the mountains, glaciers, and snow cover could be perceived as loss of honor and pride, to be interrupted as consequences of diminished morality and the ethics in this region. So the mountain regions and the glaciers are important from that spiritual perspective also. Next slide, please. Besides that, it is estimated that 129 million farmers in Indus, Ganges, and Brahmaputra basins currently depend on water that originates from glacier melt and snow melt to irrigate their crops, especially during warm and dry months before the monsoon rain starts. The availability of meltwater flow is crucial to irrigate their crops. Meltwater and glaciers and snow plays an especially important role also in buffering the drought periods. If you look at in Nepal, the Mustang and Manang regions provide a clear example of how cryospheric changes are forcing local communities to abandon their traditional livelihood and settlements and moving more towards the central and urban areas. Next slide, please. Cryospheric changes has both negative and positive impacts, especially in tourism industry. From positive angle, if we look at it, then cryospheric changes has access to inaccessible areas due to melting of glaciers, generating ice-free routes. But on the other hand, these positive impacts are very likely to be very short-lived, and while the negative impacts will be more long-lasting. The loss of glaciers and snow cover on the mountains not only spoil their appearance, but also affect the culture and belief of the systems of local people and decreases the number of tourists in this area. As a result, it results in low employment and revenue generation for the local communities from the tourism sector, which is impacting their livelihood. Tourism is also affecting Tourism is also affected by the fragile nature of mountain geography, which makes this sector unsustainable and prone to numerous disaster events such as avalanches and snowstorms, landslides, and glacial lake outburst floods. Next slide, please. Again, the cryospheric changes, as we can see, particularly changes in snowfall pattern, have adverse effect in the livelihood of the communities. Major adverse effects include crop loss and failure, fodder shortages, livestock deaths in these areas. In many areas, communities have even abandoned the agriculture and pastoralism in response to cryosphere change and other non-cryospheric and other non-climatic driver of changes. So these impacts have increased socioeconomic vulnerability to the mountain communities, including food and nutrition insecurity. However, these are some few short-term positive impacts, such as improved access to previously inaccessible sites for animal grazing and tourism, etc. Next slide, please. And this is the end of my presentation. And my presentation is based on the two documents that was produced by ICIMOD and the partners. Please feel free to download it in the web as it is freely available. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Neera. This was a very insightful presentation. We have a question for you, two questions actually, both come from Africa, Nigeria and Ghana. The question is, how can stakeholders in the society and environmental sector limit the negative impacts of glacier on communities where the occurrence are predominant? And a related question, does constant cooking with biomass by women, like when they do firewood, charcoal, etc., how does it affect glaciers if it does? Thank you.
Thank you so much for the question. For the first question about how can we limit the impact, it might be very difficult to nullify the impact, but there are some measures that we can do to limit the impacts. For example, monitoring and early warning is something that we can start doing, working on it. A regular track of glaciers, their melt rates, and others like glacial lake outburst floods. If we can establish some monitoring network and develop some the early warning systems, maybe at the local level or at like at the scientific level. So that is something that we can see how the impacts can be minimized. The other thing is also we can do the disaster preparedness and response planning activities, which can be done, like it is more like the preparedness part than reducing the impact, but it is also important for us to prepare for the disaster that comes on the way. Some of the measures could also be the infrastructure and land use planning, especially when we look at the infrastructure, then it should be climate resilient infrastructure that can help. Then when we talk about land use planning, it's the zoning where we can limit the settlement in those areas which has cryospheric hazards and impacts and risks in those areas. Then some other examples could also be restoration of ecosystem, and we're talking about nature-based solutions also that can also reduce the impacts. But one of the important measure, I would say, is also how we can engage the communities and make them aware and educate them about the impacts of glacier melt and the cryospheric hazards and impacts. So these are some of the quick reflections on the first question. The second question, I can just say that, the constant cooking and the biomass use can have impact on the glaciers directly or indirectly. I'm not the expert on this, but maybe we can take this later. I know about black carbons that can impact, but that can be discussed later in the Q&A session. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Neera. And now I'm happy to introduce Stefan Uhlenbrook. He's Director of Hydrology, Water and Cryosphere at the World Meteorological Organization, and he will drive us through some common misconceptions about glaciers. Stefan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Brigitte. Dear colleagues, next slide, please. We have looked at a lot of data over the last almost 1 hour and a lot of detailed results and information, and we understand that it might be an overload. So therefore, I have only one slide to show you, and in the next three minutes or so, I just want to guide you through a couple of common misconceptions to maybe kick off also the discussion. First thing, glaciers are remnants from the last ice age. Well, no, but also yes. First, many of the glaciers that we see nowadays are probably were there during the last ice age, which probably ended some 10,000 years ago, and we talk about tens of thousands of years. Other glaciers are much older. So if you look at Antarctica, we have glaciers that are probably there in the millions of years, and so they existed for a much longer time. So that they are so old, or some of them are very old, that still still wasn't stress the point that they're still very much alive. You know, they are sensitive climate indicators. They are rapidly retreating, as Isabella showed us, globally and very consistently, particularly taking up in speed with the acceleration of the retreating since in the 80s, 90s. And that is linked to global warming. All this also shows how important it is that we continuously monitor these glaciers and even upscale our monitoring to better understand these dynamics and also provide the necessary data and information about these sensitive climate indicators to our policy and decision makers. Next click, please. Glaciers are only of local interest and they affect only the indigenous people living in the high mountains. So that could be another misconception. I think this is clearly no. I think John made the point that melt from glaciers can also be important for downstream water users. Maybe not the overall percentage if we look at the whole river basin, because the real glaciarized part of a whole river basin is maybe small. So the percentage is maybe little, but particularly during some seasons in the summer, for instance, the melt from glaciers can be still significant in the overall stream flow, or significant for the recharge of water resources, for groundwater, for instance, that we then use for our drinking water or for irrigating our crops, etc. So and it's the glaciers, but it's the whole cryosphere and the high mountains, which are very, very important for the people, and not only for the people living up in the high mountains, but also downstream, and that includes changes or threatening of infrastructure due to flooding and glacier outburst floods, as Neera was talking about. And so, clear no to this question. The third one more click, please. The glaciers are just sitting there. You know, they're in the mountains. So we look at them and they're not moving. But I think after these beautiful presentations from the colleagues, it's crystal clear. No, glaciers are moving. It's the interplay between snow accumulation, often in the temperate climate in the winter, and the ablation then in the summer period, and then the gravity that moves the glaciers forward, and with the interplay between accumulation and ablation. The movement is, I think, John, did you say it's Canadian speed or so? But it's maybe not super fast, but it's in the meters or tens of meters, and for some glaciers even up to hundreds of meters per year. So there's a really significant moving forward. Number 4, please. 2 more to go. The glaciers are moving backwards when they're retreating. No, the glaciers are always moving forward. The gravity moves them forwards. It's just that the melting is faster than, or is more significant than the accumulation in the upper parts of the glacier. So it's kind of, it looks maybe that the terminus of the glaciers is moving upwards, but it's more the ablation is stronger than the accumulation. That's what it makes looking as if they're moving backwards. What does it mean if the glaciers are retreating? They're not moving backwards, but then more water resources become available downstream. That means the water that was stored in the mountains is now mobilized. It's now flowing down in the rivers and become available to users. You could say, well, in many parts of the world where we do not have sufficient water resources, this is a good thing, you know, because we have more water for some years. However, mind you that this storage of water, if it disappeared, it's not recharged again. So it could be that the glacier melt, if it's melting for a couple of decades, provides more water resources availability downstream for some years, but then later we have to see. It depends then how is the rainfall, how is the snowfall in the whole region of the mountains, what does that mean for the water resources availability downstream? And in many parts of the world, it has been showing that actually the overall water resources availability is then worse. So it's kind of crossing the top or the peak of water availability and then a diminishing of water resources. So that is related to this. Another click, please. There was also a question in the chat about sea level rise. What is the impact of glaciers on sea level rise? When we started, Brigitte made the point that only recently it was confirmed by integrating a couple of global temperature data sets that 2024 was the warmest year on records. 2023 was the previous year, the warmest year on record, and we had temperature records for many months in a row. So the global warming is there, and that warming in the atmosphere is also translated to warming in the oceans. We also have record temperature in the oceans. One misconception is then, yes, because of warmer water is expanding. So warmer ocean water is expanding, and that is causing sea level rise, which is true to some extent, but it's not the only reason. It's also the pumping of the groundwater from the continents and then discharged to the oceans that is contributing to sea level rise. So less water stored on the continents, but it's also the glacier melt that contributed to that. It depends a little bit on the scientific definition of what is counted here, but it's in the order of 25 to 30%. This known ice melt, or the ice melt in particular, that contributed to sea level rise so far. We're probably now in the order of above 1 millimeter per year sea level rise because of that. In that order of magnitude, obviously that can even increase further if global warming would continue. So my point I want to make here, it's also the melting of the cryosphere and including the glaciers that contributes to a sea level rise, which is impacting tremendously the coastal regions, it's impacting tremendously small island states, etc. And my last misconception, if I may, it's nothing lives on glaciers. Also, this deserves a clear no. It's microbes, it's algae, it's small insects that can be found there. Experts are fascinated by the study object. It has multiple implications also on the color of the glacier. So therefore on the melt rate because of the albedo. We can explain that in the discussion. But it has a very distinct biodiversity. So it's not true that nothing lives on glaciers, but we live from glaciers. Thank you. Over to the discussion now.
Thank you so much, Stefan, and to all of our panelists today and everyone who's joining online. Now we'll go to the Q&A part of this event. Please keep writing your questions in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many as we possibly can and look forward to answering them. To bounce back off what Stefan was saying, we've got a question about sea level rise and sea temperatures, which you addressed already. But they were asking also what kind of policy actions are the most affected countries looking at, especially countries in West Africa that also deal with heat from global warming. Anything you could comment on that?
Well, the only thing that really helps is stabilizing the climate. But putting some plastic blankets on glaciers, I think Isabella made that point crystal clear. That's super local measure that is quite costly as well, with other environmental consequences. So no, but the only thing is if we really want to stop the acceleration of glacier melt and melting of the whole cryosphere, also the permafrost and other elements of the cryosphere, the sea ice, the ice shelves, etc., is we need to stabilize global warming. We have, and that's we do by reducing emitting greenhouse gases. And then small island states, or you said somebody in Africa wrote the question. So many questions, I lost the overview. Yeah, as much as they help with mitigating climate change, it can help otherwise adapting to sea level rise, through coastal protection and so on, is something that needs to be invested in.